All right, well, it's 11:30. Matt is here. So let me kick this off. So I am Jason DeBacher. I'm a professor of economics at the University of South Carolina and president of the PSL Foundation. I want to welcome you all here to our first PSL Demo Day. So this is a first in a series of talks that PSL model contributors will be giving that'll show you how to use the models and how to contribute to these projects. So for our first demonstration, we have Matt Jensen from AEI here to show you how to create a reform file that's an input to many or all of our tax models in the PSL community. So with that, let me have Matt take it away. Matt.
Thank you, Jason, and thanks to the Policy Simulation Library for hosting this. As Jason mentioned, I'll go through a TaxBrain. I'll use TaxBrain to show how to create a reform file today. We're going to build it up from scratch. We have a small group, so just chime in if you have questions, either in the chat or just unmute yourself and feel free to to shout at me too. I'm going to share my screen now, and then we can jump into things. I hope this can be interactive, so do let me know if you have questions. I am going to try to move quickly too, so I'll have some time at the end as well for questions. We're going to be doing this today on Compute Studio. You can either follow along on my screen, or if you want to go ahead and log in yourself and follow along that way, feel free to log in yourself or to sign up. It's compute.studio, and then in the upper right, you'll see an option to log in if you're, or sign up if you're not logged in already. The application that we're using is called TaxBrain. And this is a front end to, it's an integrator model for some of Policy Simulations Library's tax models, including Tax Calculator, which is a calculator of the US individual income and payroll tax code. And it's also integrated with a tax data preparation routine called tax data. And it's also integrated with a behavioral model. Today, we'll mostly be walking through the tax law parameters in order to show how to create a reform. In particular, you'll see here is one of the steps in the demo day, one of the steps for the demo. We're going to end with a cliffhanger in that I'm not actually going to walk you through the, we're not going to simulate the reform that we create today. We're only going to talk about creating the reform. The simulation itself will happen in a coming demo day in which one of the maintainers of TaxBrain will present how to simulate this with TaxBrain. And then we'll also probably use reform files like this one or similar to this one in other demo days. The files we create today, they can be used with a wide range of PSL models beyond TaxBrain. You can go look at those either by visiting pslmodels.org. pslmodels.org. It'll take you to the Policy Simulation Library website. Here you can go and look at the catalog where you can see the models that are included. I'll just quickly go through here and point out where you can use the reform files that we'll be creating today. You'll be able to use them with the behavioral responses model for partial equilibrium analysis of individual income and payroll tax reforms in the United States. You'll be able to use them with the cost of capital calculator for evaluating the US federal taxes effect on business investment incentives. OGUSA, which is overlapping generations model. TaxBrain, of course. They work with Tax Calculator and Tax Cruncher. Tax Cruncher is helpful for looking at the impact of a reform on representative sample households rather than looking across a population-wide estimate. Okay, back to Compute Studio. Also notice you can find many of these models on Compute Studio if you'd prefer to use with the graphical user interface that Compute Studio provides. If you click on this drop-down menu in the upper left, you'll see a number of the models that I just mentioned in PSL also available from Compute Studio, and then you can click through to any of them and experiment. We'll have demo days on them in the future. I'll also note one more just bit of background regarding demo days. We're covering the web apps in this one, and some of the future demo days will also, especially in the early demo days, I think we'll focus on graphical user interfaces. That's what my colleagues have indicated as their preference for showing users how to get started and walking through some of the concepts here. But there are also Python models, and in later demo days, we'll show how to use reform files in the Python models and how to perform more powerful analyses once you're actually working locally with the data that you can then manipulate and bin and break into pieces however you'd like. Okay, reform file. I hope I gave you enough time to sign up if you haven't already for Compute Studio, or as I said, you can follow along here. The first thing we're going to want to do is set the start year to 2020 or 2021. Probably 2021 is the right place to start now, since most policy being discussed now would not be enacted until 2021 or later. So let's go ahead and start there. What that's going to do is that all of the policy parameters we're going to go through that you can use through this model, Social Security payroll tax rate, maximal taxable earnings for Social Security, we're going to walk through a number of these. All of these parameters, the base year value is what's shown right now. And the base year right now is still set at 2019 because I have not clicked reset here. But once I click reset here, then all of the base values are going to update to the 2021 start year. You can also choose the data source. You can choose whether you're using a full sample. If you want faster results, you can click use a 2% sample. Data source, you can either choose a public use file based or a current population survey. These are not particularly relevant today, again, because I'm not going to go through and show you outputs. It would be quite relevant if I was showing you outputs. It is still relevant in some ways because the input to today, because the input parameters that you see available will depend on the data source. There will be some input parameters that make sense to use with the public use file, and there will be some input parameters that make sense to use with the current population survey. Feel free to explore that. For now, I'm just going to stick with the default. Okay, let's go ahead and update to the 2021 start year. We click reset. Now we're set. You notice the maximal taxable earnings bumped up. All of the other parameters will have been reset as well. The next thing that I talked about selecting data source. We're going to stick with the normal one. The next thing we're going to do is go through and edit some parameter values, which is the most basic part of creating a reform file. The first thing you'll notice when you start looking at creating a reform file is that these values are not round and nice as you might expect with tax law, and that's because in the years that are beyond the year that IRS have published tax forms for, we're using inflation adjustments to round these, and we're not following the IRS rounding rules. And so this gets you close. This is probably the best thing to do when calculating, if you're trying to get an accurate revenue estimate. There is some argument that maybe the model should try to use the rounding rules. We don't right now. And so you'll see this is not a round number. That's okay. When you're creating a reform file, you can just change it to the number that you'd like to see in the reform, and the revenue estimate will get you pretty close. Let's go through. I mean, we can create any reform we want here. I'm just going to create something that is maybe fun and adventurous, but feel free to chime in if there's some area of the tax code that you'd like to see me adjust and have a reform provision for in a reform file. For something fun and adventurous, looking at the polling outcomes, the polling data right now, maybe maybe this is too early, but the polling outcomes lead me to believe that we should be looking at tax hikes rather than tax cuts. So maybe let's bump this one up to 25%. Another interesting thing here, and this is what I'm going to try to walk you through today, is all these interesting things to note, because you need to know these when you're doing modeling with these models. This is 12.4% rather than 6.2% under default Social Security payroll tax rate. Why is it 12.4% rather than 6.2%? Well, we combine employee and employer sides. And so there's an implicit assumption here that the burden of the employer tax cut falls on employees, and we've combined the two rates together to give a total rate for Social Security payroll tax rate. We do the same thing with the Medicare payroll tax rate below. So 25% for Social Security payroll tax rate. Now let's go make some new changes. Again, feel free to chime in if there's an area that's interesting to you, and if not, I'll just walk you through these and point out some of the interesting aspects. Social Security taxability. So here, this is not about the payroll tax rate anymore. This is about the rate at which Social Security benefits will be taxed under the individual income tax code. The threshold for taxing them, and then the rates are actually preset. So they're going to be taxed up to 50% of their Social Security benefits will be subject to tax under current law at this threshold, and then up to 85% under current law beyond this higher threshold. Let's go ahead and leave those where they are. Here are some above the line adjustments. Here we introduce what's called a haircut parameter. In some cases where you just want to get rid of, where you might just want to get rid of a parameter or adjust it by some multiplicative factor, we use these haircuts. So a haircut of 1 would mean that we got rid of the adjustment on the 1040 for student loan interest. I don't think that's going to happen. Looking at those polling results, so I'll leave that where it is now too. Let's continue down. Here we have miscellaneous exclusions. This is the investment income exclusion rate haircut. You can set a haircut amount here. If you don't know what these are, if you don't want to know what some of these are, we provide you helpful information under these information I's. If you still don't know what it means, decimal fraction of investment income base that can be excluded from AGI, if that still doesn't make sense to you, I recommend looking either at the 1040, the IRS form 1040, and looking at the investment income exclusion, or you can ask a question at discourse.pslmodels.org. So if there's ever a time when you're trying to create a reform file, you don't understand something, feel free to ask a question, discourse.pslmodels.org, and we'll have someone get back in touch with you and give some explanation. Child and elderly care. This is deduction for child care cost, haircut. Let's leave that alone. Personal exemption. Personal exemption is currently eliminated, but it's scheduled to return in a few years. Let's go ahead and make it return in 2021 by providing a personal exemption here. So this is, in some ways, a tax cut. But this is the type of tax cut maybe we can be expecting in the near future. Personal exemption goes up to 2,000. Let's go ahead. Look at the standard deduction. You can adjust the standard deduction. Here, one thing that's interesting to note is that there are different values for different filing statuses. Single, married filing jointly, married filing separately, head of household, widowed. They all have different values in the, for the parameters in the tax system. You can adjust any of them independently. This is the same, and here's another thing, interesting thing, personal refundable tax credit. This is also different by filing status. One thing you'll notice here is that the values are 0 under current law, and so this is a parameter that has been considered a tax law provision that's been considered in the past that policymakers like to think about, but has not been currently implemented into law. And so you could add a personal refundable credit to the tax code by entering values here, and then they would be in our reform file. Let's go ahead and say that every tax unit, regardless of their filing status, is going to get a personal refundable credit of 1,000. Maybe it's phased out. So maybe at some point, the credit starts phasing out. Let's say 50,000 for everyone. Oops. 5,000, 50,000, 50,000, and widowers the same. 50,000. And is there a phase out rate? Well, if we have a phase out start, we probably want to phase it out at some rate. And this will be reduced at this rate for each dollar of AGI exceeding the threshold. So maybe a 10% rate. And you'll notice again that I'm entering percents as a decimal rather than as a percent. And let's go, I'm going to do show you one more interesting thing you can do creating these reform files here. You can choose whether the parameters are inflation adjusted or not. And so we're setting the value in 2021 at 50,000 for this phase out start. But the fact that this CPI flag is marked blue shows that this is actually going to be increased with current population inflation with CPI every year after 2021. And so this value will go from 50,000 to, let's say, 52,000, 54,000, depending on what the CPI rate is in each of the years in the future. We can turn that off if we want by clicking here, and that'll make that false. So it won't be inflated anymore, and this value will just remain 50,000 forever. Let's jump down a little farther. Here you can go through the EITC, new refundable child tax credit. Again, this is one that's 0 under current law. Itemized deductions. There are a great deal of parameters, both in current law and set to 0 under current law, that you can adjust regarding to itemized deductions. And then I want to get you down to tax rates before I go ahead and show you before we go ahead and make the reform file. So here are some tax rates. The personal income tax rate. This is the lowest rate. Here's the bracket value. Let's go change the highest rate. Why not? So the highest rate right now under current law is 37%. We offer you an option here to create a rate that's higher than that with a different bracket. Right now, the rate is set at 100%, but the bracket is infinity. And so this tax bracket 7 and tax rate 8 don't actually do anything. But let's go ahead and say that we're adding a new, what do you say, 50% tax rate on incomes above maybe $1 million for single and $2 million for joint, and for married filing separately, maybe it's $1 million each. Head of household, maybe $2 million, and widow. Did I get all the zeros right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. We need to add a 0. Okay, so now we're going to have a new tax bracket and a new tax rate above the 37%. And we probably want this to apply to, you'll notice that this only applies to personal income, regular, non-pass-through. We probably want to have the same thing apply to pass-through income. So let's go ahead up here do the same thing. Extra pass-through income tax bracket, extra pass-through income tax rate. 0.5, 1 million, 2 million, 1 million, 2 million, 2 million. Let's make sure we made those the same. Okay. So there's quite a bit more here that you can go through. I'm not going to walk you through all of these right now. I encourage you to go through all of the parameters, to look at the hover overs, and then to ask follow-up questions as you're interested, either momentarily when I pause or later on at that discourse link. And one other thing I should note for accessing that discourse link, if you want to come to this URL, compute.studio/PSL model/taxbrain/48422, you'll be able to see all of the text that's at the top. All of this text you'll be able to see, and you'll be able to see the defaults that I've created once I update this at this link. But let's proceed with creating this reform file. We set our pass-through rates. If there's anything else that's particularly interesting here, you can add new minimum tax, surtaxes. You can add a lump sum tax if you want. You can.
Matt, there's a good question from Peter in the chat,
Oh, yeah.
which is, what happens if values entered that isn't valid?
What happens if a value is entered that isn't valid? You'll either receive an error immediately when you enter it, or you'll receive an error when you try to run the model. But we do try to provide you some guardrails that give you some feedback about what it was that you did incorrectly, and that give you a tip on how to proceed. Let's just, for fun, let's go ahead and make a UBI. So this is UBI benefit for those under 18, maybe $1,000 a year. For those 18 to 20, $1,000 per year. And for those 21 and over. And then it's going to be taxable because we're not excluding any of the UBI benefits from AGI. I'm going to go ahead. Here you can see that there are a number of parameters that are shown but aren't included in this version of the app. If you want to see these parameters, you can switch the data source to CPS, and then you can adjust all of these parameters as well. But this is the moment of magic for creating reform files. We're going to click adjustment here, and there you go. We have a reform file. This is a JSON file. It can be used anywhere through the Python versions of the models that I mentioned earlier, and also it can be used through a Compute Studio web API if you want to interact with Compute Studio programmatically. We see at the top here, we're using the year 2021. The data source is the puff, and we're using the full sample. The adjustment, this is really the reform that we created, shows UBI above 21 at 1,000, 18 to 20, 1,000, under 18, 1,000, starts in 2021. And you can go down generally and see all of the changes that we made through the GUI. And this reform file is portable. You can just copy it and paste it in the places where it can be used. Like I said, it is a cliffhanger in that I'm not actually going to use it today, but I wanted to show you how to create it. With that, I'm going to just return the page to the top here, where you can see some of these helpful links. And then I'd like to go ahead and take any other questions that folks have. I'm going to make sure I can see the chat.
Matt, one question. Can you illustrate how to use reforms where policy is like temporary, so things are changing in the 2021, 2022, and so on?
Sure,
How
yeah. So let's say that the Social Security payroll tax hike, we're going to raise it to 25%. We're going to have a lot of money come in from that. But we want to go even higher because 25% is not high enough. And so then we can enter comma separated variables and do like a phase in from 25 starting in 2021 to 26 in 2022, 27 in 2023, 28 in 2024, 29 in 2025, and 30 2026. And so as a general matter, you can go ahead and enter any of these. In any of these boxes, you can go ahead and change the value, phase it in over years, have it change year by year by using comma separated values with the start year at the beginning. You'll also notice that I typed a little typo there, and it tells me it must be a floating point number immediately. There are other types of errors I could introduce that would give me an error when I actually go and try to run the model. I believe if I entered a negative number here, oh, that'll actually tell me immediately as well. Must be greater than or equal to 0. So this is very nice, actually. This tells me more of the errors than I thought immediately. I do believe there will still be some errors that you might get on model run. Any other questions? Did that make sense to everyone about how to create these multi-year provisions? Any questions about parameters here, or would you also feel free, like I said, to go to the discourse.pslmodels.org to ask questions.
Hey, Matt, this is Kevin Parisi. I just, wrote a question in the chat, but I figured I'd just unmute and ask it anyway.
I appreciate that. I'm having a Zoom inept and having a hard time seeing my chat and my shared screen at the same time.
Quite all right.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I was wondering, like you'd said about how the JSON file is basically portable and it required like a copy and pasting to be used in a different model. But I was wondering, is there a way that you can save that file in a named way so that you can reference it for repeated runs, or if you wanted to do an analysis of a reform package and do it incrementally and layer on components of the reform, and how to keep track of your analysis in that kind of incremental way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you're working with the Compute Stewie GUI, you can save each one of your simulations and have it be titled. So here you see this is actually a simulation that's been teed up with this reform. And I've been able to give it a title, give it some notes. And then when I leave this, it'll be saved and I can see it through my dashboard, which is loading. So we can see that I've got this creating a reform file saved in my dashboard in Compute Studio. And I could have many of those.
Got it. I didn't see that was
and then, of course, if you're working locally, you could, and each one of those will be associated with a unique adjustment because every simulation can only have a single adjustment. And so when you save these simulations, they'll be associated one-to-one with your reform files. You can also, of course, if you're working locally with the models, you have to kind of manage that yourself with your file naming schemes and organization and so forth.
Cool. I just didn't realize the whole top part of that was editable.
Oh yeah, this is so I should say that I'm not sure he's on the call today, but Hank Dupé has been leading development of Compute Studio, and he's added a lot of cool features like this over the last year where these simulations are kind of shareable entities now, and you can edit it, you can come down here, you can share it, you can add authors, if you'd like to have multiple people interacting on the same simulation, you can fork them. So if you want to create a copy of the simulation and work from it, you can fork it. You can see the history of forks. So there's a lot of cool kind of shareability, for lack of a better term, around these simulations now. Any other questions? Was there anything put into chat that I'm still missing? No, I think I got them all in chat. Okay, then it's 12 o'clock exactly. We want to keep these short and sweet. So I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye to all of you. Thanks a lot for attending. Thanks for the questions, Kevin and Peter, and I hope to see you all on the demo days in the future that my colleagues present.
All right, thanks, Matt.
Take care, everyone.